All right, okay, so it's Monday, it's after spring break. Welcome to our class on gender and globalization and James Bond. So let me put this up. Slideshow from beginning. Gender and the spy. So the assigned reading, Engaging Cinema, which is talking about gender relations. Frederick Jameson, The Preface to Cultures of Globalization. This is a really famous book. And then the movie, You Only Live Twice. So that's what we're talking about. Let me ask you this. What do you already know about James Bond before this class? How many of you have seen a James Bond movie before? How many of you have never seen a James Bond movie before? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. Had you heard of James Bond before? Yes. Had you seen Austin Powers before? I read a statistic that somebody did a study. I don't know how they did this. That around the world, more than half the population of the whole world has seen a James Bond movie at least once. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. I think that's interesting, partially one of the reasons why I'm teaching the James Bond movie. If you think about globalization and you think about the way culture works around the world, the fact that half the population of the world has seen a James Bond movie or has seen a James Bond movie. And think about, let me just ask you, when I say, what do you already know about James Bond, you tell me. Actually, the people who never saw a James Bond movie, what did you already know about him? You guys said you never saw it. What did you already know? He's a spy. What else? Arietta, Gina? Tuxedo. Yeah, what else? Martini, shaken, not stirred. Right? Have you heard that line before? Yeah, you had. Yeah, even though you hadn't seen it. What else? British. Okay, for those of you who have seen it, like what are some of the other things that you already knew about James Bond? Yeah. Lots of sex. Yeah. There's always some secret underground organization that's trying to take over the world or destroy the world. Yeah. Things are getting blown up. So special effects. What else? He travels around the world, right? The movies are never in one location. He's always going to some other country. Significantly, Khaled, most of the explosions take place in other countries. Actually, that's one of the things I thought was really. Has anybody seen Skyfall? What I thought was really interesting about Skyfall is this is one of the first times I've seen a James Bond movie where most of the things that got destroyed happened in England. Usually it's in India or in Afghanistan or in Nicaragua or in Jamaica or wherever. So that. Is James Bond a movie that, let's just get really, really obvious, that lots of women go see? No? Why not? Because it's sexist, right? So most of you probably, even if you've never seen a James Bond movie, you already know that women are objectified in the movies, that they tend to be sexist. Um, until Daniel Craig started acting, and then the men started being objectified too. So what else? Anything else? Anybody that we missed? We're forgetting something. Cold War, Russia, right? I think most of you knew because you knew he was a spy, right? So you kind of have a sense that if he's a spy, that has something to do with communists and capitalist relations, something to do with the Cold War. So what do you already know about the Cold War? Now that's another question. I think some of you learned this in high school. If your high school American history education were anything like mine, then usually American history stops at like the Korean War, because it gets uncomfortable. The Vietnam War is too uncomfortable, so my high school didn't talk about it. I don't know about your high school. Yeah. You had to learn Russian. Yeah. That was really common. Actually, and then during the Cold War, throughout the country, universities started building Russian language programs, Russian literature programs, Russian cultures programs. So English majors were studying Dostoevsky and who else? Tolstoy, Chekhov, and Russian language was taught everywhere because we needed to be ready for the Cold War. After 1991, suddenly all those programs at universities are like, oops. So the State University of New York, SUNY Albany, just cut its Russian program. All the professors, that's a whole bunch of professors who are sitting there going like, oh, crap. I don't have a job anymore because Russian's not important. But yeah, so there's that. Okay, so I wanted to kind of go over what the Cold War is. I think a lot of you already know this. 1947 to 1991 is the conflict between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Eastern Bloc. NATO doesn't really have much of a function anymore. It still exists, but it doesn't really matter much. And the Eastern Bloc. Essentially, you have the United States and the Soviet Union competing for influence, also competing for control of the world's resources. This includes oil, this includes diamonds, this includes gold, this includes all sorts of things. Iron, rubber. If you were wondering why Vietnam was really important, a lot of it was resources, rubber. There was also a race for technological superiority and military strength, nuclear wars, rockets, space, satellites, computer technology. The internet, which you all use, was invented as a way of winning the spy game. The idea of the internet was, what if radio and telecommunications go out? How are we going to communicate with each other? We have the internet now. The internet was originally a military invention. And then, of course, we have the ideological differences between communism and capitalism. What happens, of course, is when you have two countries that are so powerful as the Soviet Union and the United States were. I mean, the Soviet Union and the United States after World War II, they were the surviving powers. Everybody else had gotten blown up. So they're so powerful that they know that they can kill each other. So there's this concept called mutual assured destruction, which basically means The United States knows it will never be attacked because the other country will get wiped out if they attack us. Why do you think North Korea wants nuclear weapons? Well, they saw Iraq got invaded because Iraq didn't have any weapons, even though our politicians said that they did. So, of course, North Korea is like, we better get some nuclear weapons, because if we have nuclear weapons, then nobody's going to attack us, because of the idea of mutual assured destruction. You attack us, then you're also destroyed. Doesn't matter how good you are militarily, nuclear weapons are that horrible. And trust me, I've been to Hiroshima, I've been to Nagasaki, I've seen the stuff. Nuclear weapons are horrible. Of course, regular weapons are pretty horrible too. But so we have this policy of détente. And the policy of détente means that the countries who have nuclear weapons will never attack each other directly. But they still want control. Now, what's happened, and I think this doesn't always get told in the history of the Cold War, especially in American classrooms, because American classrooms, your American history classrooms, like college, you were saying, is focused on the United States versus Russia. But the Cold War is not fought in the United States or Russia. The Cold War is fought everywhere else. Korea and Vietnam, Congo, Nigeria, Libya, Somalia, Iran, Iraq, Middle East, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Grenada. The Cold War was fought everywhere. It wasn't cold in these places. Now, what do all these places have in common? You tell me. Well, not all of them, but most of them. Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah. They didn't have as well funded of a military, Stephanie? That's complicated. Actually, most of them, that's complicated. I want to come back to that. Billy? Third world countries. How do we define third world country? Or American satellites during the Cold War. Third world countries, they were all colonies until World War II. So, Stephanie, when you say they don't have democracy, well, they didn't have democracy because they were ruled by England and France and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and Italy. Does that make sense? Until 1947. Then in 1947, between 1947 and 1970, all of these countries had to fight for their independence, the same way that the United States fought for its independence in 1776. Except I want you to imagine a slightly different scenario. In 1776, white Americans fought for independence from England. Now I want you to imagine if in 1776, Native Americans and African Americans were the ones fighting for their independence, and they were the ones who won that war. That's what was happening between 1947 and 1960. Vietnam, French colony. Korea, Chinese and Japanese colony. Congo, Belgian colony. Nigeria, English colony. Somalia, half of it was an English colony, half of it was an Italian colony. Iran and Iraq, colonies. Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, and Colombia, not colonies, but the United States controlled them. Now, coming back to Stephanie, your point about they didn't have democracy. Guatemala had democracy. They elected a politician that the United States government did not like. The CIA assassinated him. Congo had a revolution, got independence, had democracy. They elected a politician that the United States didn't like. The CIA assassinated him. You go through every single country. Every single one of these countries. Dominican Republic, same thing. Haiti, same thing. Grenada, we invaded it. So they had democracies. But when the democracies did not do what either the United States or the Soviet Union liked, the Soviet Union or the United States would try to influence what was happening there. So a lot of them ended up not having democracy. Vietnam, same situation. They had a democracy. The United States did not like who they were electing. So we created this conflict, this North versus South, but it really wasn't North versus South. Guatemala, by the way, what happened in Guatemala after the United States killed the democratically elected leader was this led to a civil war which lasted 50 years. Can you imagine a country having a civil war that lasts 50 years? For what? Coffee and bananas? Because it was the United States owned the coffee and banana farms. The democratically elected president wanted to give the land back to the Native Americans who live there. Half the country is indigenous. The United States would not let that happen. So this is what I mean by local conflicts in post-colonial countries. And this, of course, is why James Bond is always flying around the world, going to all these little countries and having sex with Asians and Latin Americans and Africans and whatever, right? That's the Cold War. Okay, what does the Cold War have to do with gender? Several things. You guys can imagine, you guys can guess. This is up to you. This is a question for you to figure out. Cold War has to do with gender because you're talking about a battle of ideologies, capitalist versus communist. So in the 1980s, what I remember when I was a kid is that we would all joke and say that communist women were fat and looked like men. Nobody says that anymore because everybody now knows. If you've seen any pictures of Russians, you know that Russian women are not fat and do not look like men. Now they're supermodels and like doing all that kind of stuff. That was the joke we made. What does James Bond do when he goes to all these third world countries? He has to seduce them. He has to convince the Russian agent or the Chinese woman or the Japanese, whoever it is. She sleeps with him. She's so impressed by his penis that she decides that England must be a good place. She's now on the side of NATO. It's a ridiculous story, but that's basically James Bond, right? So what does Cold War have to do with gender? That's what it has to do with gender. It gets more complicated than that. Gender relations get very confusing because the United States is during the Cold War is promoting two things at the same time. Two conflicting ideas of what it means to be a woman. On the one hand, the United States is very committed to the Leave It to Beaver, stay-at-home mom, conservative, traditional family values, the man works, the woman's at home, nuclear family, all this kind of stuff, right? That's very much part of the United States ideology. At the same exact time, the United States is also promoting going to the beach, freedom, doing what you want, feeling good, true love, experimentation. What makes America great is that we have freedom to have sex with whoever we want. And what makes America great is that we have traditional family. We have these two conflicting ideologies, right? So these ideologies get played out in the Cold War. Now you can imagine that every other country is having the same exact issues, right? They have these competing gender roles. Gender roles get complicated. I've so far just been talking about the United States. Gender roles get complicated when you start talking about the relationships between what gender means in the United States and what gender means somewhere else. All right. So here's my question. This is why we're focusing on James Bond. I can look at a lot of different other movies. If I wanted to look at globalization and film, I actually think the Bourne Identity movies are better. There's a movie called The International, which I think does a better job of doing this. Babel, has anybody seen Babel? Like, that's a better movie about globalization. Why do I want to look at James Bond? James Bond is the only film franchise. I mean, look at it. Every year or every 2 or 3 years, they come out with a new one. So you begin, when you start to look at the James Bond movies, you start to see that there's a relationship with history, that the James Bond character becomes its own person. He becomes like this signifier, this idea, a way of looking at the history of the world, a really stupid way of looking at the history of the world, but, you know. And the question that I want to ask is, does James Bond change? Because if James Bond is changing, then maybe we can start to notice changes in the world in general, right? Maybe the James Bond movies reflect new attitudes towards the world, new attitudes towards women, new attitudes towards other things. So, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, which is what you guys are seeing, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Diamonds Are From Other. I mean, almost every 2 years, you have a new James Bond movie. Goldfinger is about the gold standard that we talked about. You Only Live Twice is about Japan and China relationships. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, about the effectiveness of the United States. Diamonds Are Forever is about Las Vegas. Las Vegas was a new place then, right? All of these things are about Cold War politics, you know. Soviet Union, the United States, who's going to control, and Billy, what Billy said, the secret underworld organization, right, that we don't know. This is what's really fascinating about the James Bond movies, I think. Originally, the James Bond movies were supposed to just be Russia versus the United States, or Russia versus England, actually. But the United States got involved because because of Hollywood. But Russia versus the United States is really simple. It's too simple. The story would be boring. So what Ian Fleming did and what the Hollywood people did, they said, let's create this other thing, this secret organization, right? So all the bad things that are happening in the world are not caused by the United States or Russia. All the bad things are caused by this made-up fantasy organization. Everything that possibly could go wrong with the United Nations, everything that could possibly go wrong with détente, everything that was risky, it's put on this other organization, the secret organization, that James Bond has to stop. Does that make sense to you guys? This is why James Bond is a fantasy movie. It basically is displacing, we talked about the word displacement, displacing all of the anxieties, all of the political concerns onto a fantasy organization. In the 1970s, they have to come up with new ideas. They're getting bored. So we have Live and Let Die, which is about racial politics in the United States. If you know your history of American movies, especially if you're a Quentin Tarantino fan, you know that in 1973 was right after the movie Shaft and Foxy Brown came out. So basically James Bond was like, oh, Shaft and Foxy Brown are popular. We should make a James Bond version of that. That's Live and Let Die. Moonraker is all about space shuttles, so there's all this space stuff and lasers. This was right after Star Wars came out. So basically Moonraker is the James Bond's version of Star Wars. But it's also about the space race. Octopussy is about England's former colonies, India. View to a Kill, 1985. Suddenly you have computers in Silicon Valley, so that's what that movie's about. Living Daylights is about the Soviet conflict in Afghanistan, which Americans forgot about as soon as we left. And then it came back to bite us in the butt. Right? You guys all know that? I always think that everybody should know this, but then I find out that people don't know this. The United States was giving weapons to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Then we left. Meanwhile, like, Al-Qaeda is sitting there going like, cool, we got all these weapons, but now what? And then they became Al-Qaeda. The United States just left after we beat the Soviet Union. Why were the Soviet Union in Afghanistan? They wanted a oil pipeline and access to the water. So whatever, that's what that was about. It's stupid. But that's what the Living Daylights was about in 1987. 1989, you have the war on drugs, so that's what License to Kill is about. So you can see that the Cold War is still there, but they're starting to look at other issues. And this is one of the things that I think is really interesting about James Bond, is that you can kind of see the history of the world in these movies, even though it's a really weird and wrong version of the world. However, Cold War ends in 1989. Notice what happens. The Cold War is over, right? No James Bond movies for 6 years. I just showed you this. Like every year, almost every year, a new James Bond movie, a new James Bond movie. Cold War is over, and Hollywood is like, ooh, how do we make a James Bond movie now? We also, in the 1970s and 80s, we have feminism is becoming stronger. We have the Violence Against Women Act is passed, equal rights amendments. And so the old James Bond motif of this kind of misogynistic, sexist guy who slaps women on the butts and sleeps with everybody. In the original movies, he actually does slap women on the butt. There's no way he's going to do that now. So GoldenEye, they didn't know what to do, and a lot of people just thought James Bond was dead. So then they made GoldenEye, and GoldenEye is specifically about the question of whether James Bond is relevant anymore. It's about the end of the Soviet Union. So actually, the movie begins with symbols of the Soviet Union's fall, like rubble, and that's what GoldenEye is about. And the M is replaced by a woman, so Judi Dench becomes the boss. So you have a female boss. The object of James Bond's affection actually speaks back and says, "You stupid idiot, why are you acting like this?" I'm not kidding. She says, "You stupid idiot, why are you acting like this?" So you have a new James Bond is coming. Then you have Tomorrow Never Dies, which is basically a parody of Fox Television. The evil character in Tomorrow Never Dies is somebody who looks a lot like Rupert Murdoch and acts a lot like Rupert Murdoch, who is the president of Fox Television. Then you have The World Is Not Enough, which is about oil pipelines in third world countries. Die Another Day is about conflict diamonds from Africa. And you guys all know about conflict diamonds because you've all heard Kanye West's song, Diamonds Are Forever, right? Yes? I never know what you know. You all know Kanye West is, right? He has that song, Diamonds Are Forever. I think Nas also has a song about conflict diamonds. And then there was the movie Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio. For those of you who think Leonardo DiCaprio, has anybody seen what's the Blood Diamond? Have you guys seen that movie? Yeah. And you're like, wow, what a cutting edge movie this is. It's really addressing this political problem. The James Bond movie came out several years before it. It was also about conflict diamonds. Kanye West and Nas were doing, and Tribe Called Quest were doing hip hop about this before Blood Diamond came out. By the time Blood Diamond came out, it was late. It had already been done. The laws had already been changed. But anyway, that's what that's about. So you see that the new James Bond movies from 1995 to 2002 are starting to address slightly different issues. And I think this is useful for you because I think you guys are all struggling with globalization. I know all of you are still like, what is globalization? And what I'm trying to get at is like, if you start looking at this gradual change in James Bond movies, you start to get an image of what globalization is. Because globalization is not the Cold War. Cold War is Soviet Union versus the United States. But when you start looking at the topics after the Cold War, it's about global media. It's about conflict diamonds. Quantum of Solace is about the environment. It's actually about water. Water is the most important thing in the world, globally. Then finally, Quantum of Solace happens, and then we're still like, how is James Bond relevant? You notice that like all the new James Bond movies are constantly raising the question: is this old model, is this old Cold War model, James Bond model, is it still relevant? And the newest movie also introduces the topic of human trafficking. What's more global than that? Right? So those are some of the issues that we can talk about. Of course, when you have, because James Bond is always presenting this kind of very anxious figure in response to politics, and the politics of, not just the politics of international politics, but also the politics of gender, then of course you're going to have parodies. So the oldest parody is the Pink Panther, Dr. Goldsit and the Bikini Machine kind of gives you a obvious title, kind of making fun of the sexism in James Bond. Our Man Flint. Fathom, by the way, is basically imagining a female James Bond, but it's told in a funny way. The first Casino Royale was actually kind of a parody, even though it was based on the original novel. Spy Hard, and then of course Austin Powers is the most, probably the one that you've all seen. So you get these parodies. Okay. So how do we talk about gender when we're talking about James Bond movies? I think when you see a movie like You Only Live Twice, I don't even need to show you clips. I think the gender politics are really obvious. Like Zach, not only did you like point out when he goes to Japan, he's like, oh, I can retire to here. The women serve me, right? Yeah. Men come first, and James Bond's like, ho, 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 right? And you can imagine like all the teenage boys at this time just going like, yeah, sitting in their room alone. But then he also becomes a Japanese man, right? So it's not just that he is able to, he's objectifying women. It's that James Bond is able to become whoever he wants and then get the woman at the end, right? James Bond can become Japanese. You don't get a sense in this movie that any Japanese person can become English. But James Bond can become Japanese, and he can do anything he wants. Okay, so when we're talking about gender, I want to get the vocabulary really right. Biological sex, okay? That's when we talk about signifier, signified, and referent, biological sex. If you have a penis or a vagina, that's kind of, X and Y chromosomes, that's the referent. You guys know that that's not the only two options, right? You know that genetically there's actually more variation than that. There's people with two Y chromosomes or two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome. There's hermaphrodites. That actually exists. So it's not just two, actually. But Americans, or the world usually just divides the world up into two. Sexual identity is the signified. That's who you are. You're like, I'm a heterosexual male. This has to do with your sexual orientation, too. I'm a homosexual male. I'm a heterosexual male. I'm a homosexual female. I'm a transgendered male/female, male/female, right? Your identity, notice, is not the same thing as your actual biological sex. How you identify yourself is more variable. Finally, you have gender performance, and I'm different from the book. The book talks about this a little differently than I do. So you guys go back and look at the book. The book has these terms, but I'm talking about it a little differently. Gender performance is how you act. I act like a woman because I walk like this, I dress like this, I talk like this. I act like a man because I walk like this, I talk like this. I act like a gay man because this is how gay men act. I've seen it on television. Gender performance. We act like this all the time. All the time. You guys are actors on a stage. I'm not just quoting Shakespeare. It's true. You are always acting. And this is the signifier. You're basically signifying to other people. You're like, look, this is my gender identity. And of course, your gender performance is circular. It's part of the system. It contributes to the system, and it's influenced by the system. So this is roles, stereotypes, social practices, how we value different social practices, what you wear, all this kind of stuff. But what I want to point out to you that's important is that your actual biological sex and your sexual identity and their performance, there's not like a one-to-one correspondence. It's not like the signifier clearly means the signified and clearly has a biological referent. There's some slip. And there's all sorts of things, especially in the performance, that have nothing to do with the biology. You think about the way men and women act, that have nothing to do with the biology. And a lot of this has to do with what your book talks about, performance anxiety. And this is like James Bond is the fantasy of somebody who never has performance anxiety, right? Performance anxiety involves like you're worried about whether you can actually perform the role of a man or a woman. You're uncertain about your sexual identity, whether you're going to be successful, whether other people are going to perceive you the way you want to be perceived. And so you repress a lot of the things that don't work out. So there's always repression. Sexuality is all about sexuality inherently involves repression. As Sigmund Freud once said, 90% of sex is in your imagination. It's not in the biology. It's in your head. And that involves repression, but it also involves sublimation and transference. What is sublimation? Sublimation is when you take a messy reality. What is sublimation in chemistry, right? What is sublimation in chemistry is when a solid thing goes to a gaseous state. So philosophically and psychologically, sublimation is when you have your unconscious, all the repressed desires, the problems of the anxiety of your sexuality, the slippage between the referent, the signified, and the signifier, this kind of uncertainty, is sublimated to a higher, more easily understood state, like a gas. And you can make a pun about farts if you want, like that's because there actually is an Aristophanes play that does that, a Greek play. You're sublimating. You're transferring all your problematic relations between you and your mom, or you and your girlfriend, or you and society, or you and your classmates. You're transferring that onto something, onto objects or other people that help you cope and help you deal with your performance anxiety. May even help you perform better. So Freud is very clear about this. He doesn't say we need to get rid of repression. Freud never says, let's just stop repressing. Like, you need repression. You have to do this transference and sublimation, or you cannot cope with reality. A lot of these things a lot of the ways when we talk about transference is that you get transferred onto objects. So we fetishize certain objects. If you were watching the Academy Awards 2 weeks, and what's his name? What's his name? Seth MacFarlane? What does Seth MacFarlane fetishize? Boobies. Right? He had the whole song about boobies. It's focusing on one little thing that you can manage and objectify and deal with. It helps cope and deal with repression. In some ways, this ends up being very misogynistic. A lot of the ways, if you have performance anxiety or you have just anxiety about your ability to do things, you're going to repress your own issues, transfer them onto someone else, and sometimes that relationship can be quite hateful and violent. So men not dealing with their own shit will say really nasty things about women because it helps them make them feel better about themselves. And sometimes this will get really violent. I think you all know this already, but what I want you to look at when you're looking at James Bond is start to try to use these terms to talk about James Bond. I think I'm telling you something that you already know, but I'm just analyzing it. I'm breaking it down into its parts. The same way if I told you about sugar, you'd all be like, I know what sugar is. Sugar's sweet. And then I say, yeah, but it's 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. That's all I'm doing here. I'm breaking it down I'm breaking down something that you already know. I'm just breaking it down into little parts so that you can analyze our gender relations the same way a chemist might analyze sugar or water. In film, this is the key term. I really want you to write this down, looking relations, underline it. This is the hardest term of this unit, but it is also the most important, okay? Looking relations. Looking relations. This is key. Looking relations in your book is the relationships between what the camera sees, what characters see, and what the audience sees. The gaze. Here's why this is important. Because this is where all the stuff you're learning about gender now relates back to all the camera techniques and editing techniques that we learned before. Think about how a camera works. Shows you the establishing shot, gives you some point of view shots, some over-the-shoulder shots. These are all looking relations. The most important character in a movie is the camera. The most important character in a James Bond movie is not James Bond. It's the camera. Why? It allows you to see what's going on, but also it allows you to see what the other character sees. You begin to see the world the way James Bond sees it. There's something voyeuristic here. I get to see the woman's body, but she cannot see me seeing it. That means I have control. It's not real control, but that's the fantasy. That's porn. That's what porn is about. Looking relations. The editorial techniques. How you move the camera, what the camera focuses on, how you edit it, how you show points of view. You can create a fantasy that is objectifying or empowering to different characters based on what you do with the camera. You don't even need dialogue. You can have the same exact story, same exact plot, same exact dialogue. If you change what the camera does, you can change how sexist or not sexist it is. You can make a feminist James Bond movie by changing what the camera does. That's what I want you guys to think about. These are looking relations. How you represent social practices. You know. So if James Bond makes a joke about women, and then the camera does a close-up on a woman's butt, that's a looking relationship, right? On the other hand, what if James Bond made a joke, and then the camera showed the woman's face, and she's looking the other way? Bam! James Bond just got dissed. Do you see what I'm saying? Same dialogue, same story. You change what the camera does and what it focuses on. You can totally change what you're taught. You can totally change the meaning. Part of this is how we represent social practices. How are we doing on time? We're almost done. Good. So how we represent social practices. Certain behaviors. Are certain behaviors made to seem like they're okay? Are certain behaviors made to seem like they're not okay? So in a lot of ways, James Bond movies were very liberating because they were part of the sexual revolution in the 1960s that said sex was okay. And a lot of feminists were doing the same thing. But on the other hand, it's representing social practices in a very specific way. So it's not so simple as just saying James Bond is anti-feminism, because a lot of the feminists were also arguing for liberation, more liberated view of sexuality, and James Bond was doing the same thing. On the other hand, James Bond's version of that tended to be very masculine and misogynist until GoldenEye, but Skyfall forgot. Okay. But how does this relate to global relations? Well, obviously, when you have James Bond, you have exotic female others, you have exotic locations. There's always a kind of relationship between the woman and the place. We also have white male privilege in the world. James Bond can go anywhere he wants, but the other people can't. We have an assumption of national tradition that ignores global power relations. What I mean by this is we assume that the Japanese are Japanese, the Turkish are Turkish, the Jamaicans are Jamaican, and that's just what they are, right? And we saw this in The Searchers too, when we have the Mexican woman and she suddenly starts dancing with castanets and whatever, right? What is Japanese? Oh, samurai swords and karate. So you immediately get that. I lived in Japan for 2 years. I didn't meet anybody who went around with a samurai sword or did karate. That's true. I was not at the ninja training school. Good point. But the thing is that what you'll notice here is that when you have this kind of relationship between gender and global relations, you'll see that James Bond is a character who can do all sorts of things. He can become Japanese when he wants to. He can learn other cultures when he wants to. There's nothing where you say James Bond is British and that's all that he is. But when you look at the women from the other places, that's all that they are until they sleep with James Bond. That's how the movies structure it. What it ignores is the power relations and the actual politics and the differences in these countries and the struggles that these countries are going through, and the fact that most of these countries have people that have all sorts of different opinions and all sorts of different ideas about the things. The other stereotype is, of course, first world modernity. That means Europe and the United States are modern, and the rest of the world is not modern. Actually, I should have brought this in. I totally forgot. Somebody just showed me a picture. But there's this new show about, what's it called? that takes place in Beirut or something like that. What's it? You know what I'm talking about? It's called Is it National Security? Is that a new television show called National Security? Somebody actually showed me this. They like, here's the image of Beirut that's in the movie, and it's all like run down. It's like, it looks like really poor and third world. And then they just said, here's actual Beirut, and it looks like a modern city, because it is. So the American movie deliberately is making the third world country look poorer than it actually is. It's making the third world country look more fucked up than it actually is. Coming off of Stephanie's point, it's making the third world country look like it couldn't possibly have its own democracy, even though it may have had one. And this relates to kind of gender relations too. So I want us to start thinking, and we'll talk more about this on Wednesday and next week. I think gender relations is something that most of you are probably familiar with talking about. I wanted to give you a language so you can start talking about it and breaking it down. But I also wanted you to start thinking about gender in terms of globalization, which is when gender suddenly becomes really, really complicated. And that's what I want you to do in the James Bond movie. However, oh, darn it. Go to slide. However, keep this in mind. When you're talking about globalization, it depends on what globalization you're talking about. Are you talking about globalization during the Cold War? Or are you talking about globalization after the Cold War? And that's why I want you to see, we're going to skip from this old James Bond movie, which was right at the beginning, and we're going to skip ahead to the 2008. Whoops. We're going to skip to the 2008, which is Quantum of Solace, which is a new one. And I want you to see the difference. That's essentially that I'm trying to explain to you. I think when you see the difference between these two movies, then I'm hoping that in your mind you'll be like, oh, now I get what globalization is. That's my hope. Okay. The problem is that Quantum of Solace is a sequel to Casino Royale, so you have to see Casino Royale too. So go ahead and see that one. But I don't really care if you see Casino Royale. That's not really the point. The point, Quantum of Solace, I think, is the new one. Quantum of Solace is the movie that actually has something that's new in it, and I think you'll see that. Cool. Talk to you later. I need to